For months, the world asked one question. Why did the man who stood closest to the truth refuse to speak? And what finally broke his silence? Before we go any deeper, stay with us. If you have followed this story in fragments, in rumors, in clipped headlines, and half-translated posts, you're about to hear it in the only form that matters now. As a record of what was said, what was not said, and what that silence may have protected. Beijing, January 10th, 2026. The city moved with its usual winter restraint, but the digital world did not. A single video appeared, then spread with the speed of collective grief. The frame was simple, almost clinical. No stage lighting, no dramatic score, just a man in a white coat, seated too stiffly, as if the chair itself had become a witness stand. He was introduced as the doctor who attended to Menglong in his final days, a person whose professional life is built on discretion, a person trained to guard what the public craves most. And yet, there he was, looking directly at a camera with the exhausted expression of someone who had been carrying a secret for too long. His voice was controlled at first, not theatrical, not eager. The words came out like they had been rehearsed by pain. He described months of silence as respect, as fear, as grief. He did not present himself as a hero. He presented himself as a man who had failed to find a safe place to put what he knew. That is how the story changes. Not through a new document, not through an official briefing, but through a human being who finally admits that restraint has limits. For weeks, for months, the public narrative around Menglong had been built from absence. Fans demanded clarity. Commentators filled empty space with certainty. Social feeds turned suspicion into sport. In that vacuum, every delay looked like concealment, and every refusal to speak looked like complicity. We need to be precise here. Silence is not proof, but silence is never neutral. It shifts power. It invites projection. It turns private suffering into public property. The doctor did not offer a neat explanation. He offered something more unsettling. A portrait of final days that were far more complex than anyone had been told. He spoke of setbacks and critical decisions. He spoke of interventions that never became headlines. He emphasized that Menglong remained conscious, aware, and strangely considerate of the people around him, even while his own condition narrowed the world to hours and breath. Then came the careful boundaries. He said there were details he could not reveal. He avoided names. He avoided direct accusations. And yet he pointed beyond medicine, beyond routine, beyond the controlled environment people imagine when they picture a hospital room. He alluded to pressures that did not belong to clinicians. He implied that timing, information, and decision-making were not always governed by health alone. In that moment, the confession became something else. Not closure, not comfort, a warning. Because if the last witness is speaking, it means the private story has become too heavy to contain. And if he is still withholding parts of it, it means the truth may carry consequences that extend far beyond one death. But what the doctor revealed was not an answer. It was a doorway to a far darker question. If this story resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so that our future investigations can continue to illuminate the truths that often remain hidden behind the entertainment industry's brightest lights. Share this video across every platform where voices gather, because collective awareness is the only force capable of demanding accountability. Let us stand together, not in anger, but in clarity and compassion, to ensure that what happened to Menglong is never repeated. Let us raise our voices so that silence can no longer swallow the struggles of those who give so much of themselves to the world. Silence did not begin with the doctor's decision to withhold his statement. It began much earlier, in the hours and days immediately following Menglong's death, when words were carefully weighed and then quietly put away. According to those close to the medical team, the first instinct was not secrecy, but caution. Hospitals operate on protocol. Doctors are trained to speak only when evidence is complete, when records are finalized, when families are protected from speculation. In theory, this restraint preserves dignity. In practice, it creates a void. and voids never remain empty for long. In the weeks that followed, official updates were sparse and deliberately restrained. Statements emphasized privacy. Investigations were described as ongoing. No timelines were offered. No specifics were confirmed. Each carefully chosen phrase was meant to calm. Instead, it inflamed. The doctor watched this unfold in real time. Every day, new theories surfaced. Some were wild. Some were malicious. Some came disturbingly close to the truth. Each one pulled fragments of Menglong's final days into the public arena, stripped of context, stripped of restraint. For the doctor, this created a quiet torment. Speaking too soon would violate medical ethics. Speaking too late would allow distortion to harden into belief. He found himself trapped between two failures, one professional, one human. He later described the period as a prolonged vigil without a bedside. Sleep came in fragments. News alerts replaced heart monitors. Every headline felt like a misdiagnosis of something far more fragile than public opinion. Behind closed doors, there were meetings that never appeared in press reports. Legal counsel, institutional advisors, discussions not about what happened medically, but about what could be said without causing collateral damage. The unspoken question hovered in every room. Who would be protected by silence, and at what cost? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because silence was not enforced by a single order or a single authority. It emerged from overlapping fears: fear of lawsuits, fear of professional ruin, fear of provoking forces that medicine does not control. The doctor has never claimed he was threatened. What he described instead was pressure without fingerprints, delays without signatures, a shared understanding that some truths, if spoken too early or too clearly, would not remain confined to one case. As weeks turned into months, the silence took on a life of its own. It became policy. It became expectation. It became a shield that was increasingly difficult to lower without consequences. Meanwhile, the public narrative hardened. The absence of detail was reinterpreted as evidence. Every non-answer became suspicious. The longer the quiet lasted, the louder the demands grew. Inside the hospital, life moved forward. Patients came and went. Procedures continued. But for those who had been present in Menglong's final days, time stalled. His name lingered in corridors. His case resurfaced in whispered conversations, always unfinished, always unresolved. When the doctor finally spoke, he did not frame his silence as noble. He framed it as unbearable, a weight that compounded daily, a responsibility that began to feel indistinguishable from complicity. And yet, even in breaking that silence, he stopped short of full disclosure, not because the story was complete, but because it was not safe to complete it. He made one thing unmistakably clear: medicine had not been the only force shaping those final days. Decisions were made in rooms where stethoscopes held no authority. Timelines shifted for reasons that did not appear in medical charts. Information moved unevenly, arriving too late or leaving too early. He did not say who interfered, but he made it clear that medicine was no longer the only force in the room. Behind the closed doors of the intensive care unit, the version of events the public imagined never truly existed. There was no singular moment of collapse, no dramatic countdown. What unfolded instead was a slow tightening of margins, where each decision carried less room for error than the last. According to internal records later described by those familiar with the case, Menglong's condition shifted unpredictably. Periods of stabilization were followed by sudden regressions. Gains measured in hours were erased in minutes. The medical team adjusted continuously. Treatment protocols were revised in real time. Specialists were consulted. Advanced interventions were prepared, then postponed, then reconsidered again. On paper, it looked like diligence. In reality, it felt like running against a current that kept changing direction. What the doctor emphasized, with visible restraint, was that these fluctuations alone did not define the tragedy. Hospitals handle complexity every day. What made this case different was what happened around the medicine. Certain procedures required approvals that did not originate in the ward. Information about Menglong's condition was not always released when the medical team recommended it. At times, updates were delayed. At other times, they were filtered. The reasoning was never framed as obstruction. It was framed as protection of image, of privacy, of stability. But protection has a cost. In critical care, timing is not a detail. It is a deciding factor. Minutes determine options. Delays narrow outcomes. When information moves slowly, so do decisions. When decisions hesitate, conditions worsen. The doctor stopped short of accusing any individual. He did not describe malicious intent. What he described instead was a system where priorities competed silently. Health on one side, reputation on the other, neither openly acknowledged as opposing forces, yet constantly pulling against each other. During Yu Menglong's final days, the hospital became a place of parallel realities. Inside the room, there was a patient who remained lucid, asking staff if they were resting, thanking them between procedures, apologizing for the trouble his condition caused. Outside the room, there was a growing concern about how the story would be told if it ever escaped those walls. Nurses later recalled moments of unexpected calm, short conversations, gentle humor, determination that bordered on defiance. Even as his body weakened, his awareness did not. He understood the gravity of his situation, even if he was never shown the full picture unfolding beyond his bedside. There were moments when the team believed they might lose him, moments when alarms were silenced only because there was no time to acknowledge them. In those hours, decisions were made rapidly, instinctively, and under pressure that extended far beyond clinical judgment. What troubled the doctor most, and what he hinted at without elaboration, was the sense that some of those decisions were constrained before they reached the room. That medicine was occasionally asked to wait. That clarity was sometimes postponed. That the cost of transparency was weighed against something else. He described it as an environment where survival was no longer dictated solely by physiology. It was influenced by schedules, negotiations, and invisible considerations that never appear in medical textbooks. By the time Yu Menglong's condition reached its final stage, options had narrowed to the point where intervention became reactive rather than preventative. The team continued to fight, but the fight had changed. It was no longer about recovery. It was about time. When death came, it did not arrive as a shock. It arrived as a confirmation of what many in the room had feared but were not allowed to say aloud. In the aftermath, records were sealed. Communications were streamlined. What remained visible to the public was a simplified narrative that could not account for the complexity of what had unfolded. The doctor has since said that this was the moment his silence became unbearable, not because of guilt over medical failure, but because of the knowledge that the story being told was incomplete by design. At that point, survival was no longer a medical question. It was a political one. The confession did not end the story. It detonated it. Within minutes of the video going public, the silence that had surrounded Yu Menglong's death collapsed under the weight of collective grief. Social media platforms flooded with disbelief, sorrow, and a single recurring demand: answers. Candle emojis multiplied into digital vigils. Old interviews resurfaced. Screenshots of the doctor's pauses were dissected frame by frame, as if meaning could be extracted from hesitation alone. What had once been a private tragedy became a public reckoning. Fans did not treat the confession as closure. They treated it as evidence that something had been withheld, and that withholding now demanded accountability. Hashtags surged across languages and borders, uniting grief with suspicion. Calls for reopening investigations gained traction not because new documents were released, but because the credibility of the silence had finally fractured. International media amplified the moment. Commentators described the doctor's words as unusually restrained, carefully weighted, and ethically conflicted. Analysts noted what he did not say as much as what he did. The absence of names, the refusal to assign blame directly, the insistence that some truths remained too heavy to carry aloud. For many observers, that restraint made the confession more convincing. It suggested fear, not performance, responsibility, not theater. Behind the scenes, the response was less unified. Authorities acknowledged public concern without committing to action. Statements emphasized procedure. Timelines were deferred. The machinery of review began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if wary of accelerating under pressure. Meanwhile, Yu Menglong's family retreated further from public view. Sources close to them later described the confession as both devastating and validating. For months, They had carried the knowledge that the version of events circulating publicly did not match what they had lived privately. Hearing the doctor speak did not ease their grief. It confirmed it. Colleagues from the entertainment industry also broke their silence. Some spoke cautiously, aligning their statements with respect and remembrance. Others hinted that the pressures described by the doctor were not unfamiliar. High expectations, compressed schedules, decisions made far from hospital rooms but felt inside them. The story expanded beyond a single case. It began to touch questions that rarely receive sustained attention. What happens when fame intersects with vulnerability? How institutions manage risk when the patient is also a symbol? Where responsibility ends when outcomes become inconvenient? In online forums, fans transformed into archivists. They built timelines, compared statements, cataloged inconsistencies, not out of conspiracy, but out of a refusal to accept that complexity could be erased by silence. Yet for all the noise, one thing remained unchanged. The full truth was still out of reach. The doctor had spoken, but not completely. Others remained silent. Records existed, but were not public. The system responded, but without urgency. This is the cost of delayed truth. When it finally arrives, it does not heal. It destabilizes. It forces questions that cannot be contained within one investigation or one narrative. Menglong's legacy now exists in two forms: the public figure remembered for his work, and the private individual whose final days revealed the fragility of systems meant to protect. The doctor never claimed his confession would bring peace. He claimed only that carrying the truth alone had become impossible. And perhaps that is the final shift in this story. The realization that silence does not disappear pain. It redistributes it. The truth did not close the case. It opened wounds that were never meant to heal. The final days of Menglong were never meant to become a public lesson. They were meant to remain private, dignified, contained within hospital walls and family memory. Yet history rarely respects intention. It respects consequence. What emerged after the doctor spoke was not a verdict, but a reckoning. A recognition that the systems surrounding fame, authority, and information do not fail loudly. They fail quietly, through hesitation, delay, and restraint that appears reasonable until it is too late. There is no single villain in this story, no dramatic confession that resolves every doubt. What exists instead is a network of decisions, each defensible in isolation, yet devastating in accumulation. Medical caution, institutional fear, public relations, legal uncertainty, all operating within their own logic, all converging on one human body that did not have the luxury of time. Menglong's final struggle forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Truth does not always save lives. Sometimes it arrives only after the cost has already been paid. And when it does not arrive cleanly. It arrives fragmented, filtered, and burdened with what cannot be undone. The doctor's testimony matters not because it answers every question, but because it acknowledges the weight of knowing. He did not claim innocence. He did not claim heroism. He claimed responsibility for carrying something that could no longer remain hidden without causing further harm. That distinction is critical. In an age where outrage travels faster than evidence, restraint is often misread as guilt, but unrestrained disclosure carries its own violence. Between these extremes lies a narrow ethical corridor, one that few are prepared to walk without damage. The public response reveals how deeply people sense this tension. Fans did not mobilize simply because they were angry. They mobilized because they recognized a familiar pattern. The quiet reshaping of narratives, the delayed release of inconvenient facts, the transformation of complex human suffering into simplified closure. Menglong is remembered now not only for what he created, but for what his death exposed. The fragility of systems that promise care, the imbalance between power and vulnerability, the cost of protecting images at the expense of individuals. If there is a legacy here, it is not certainty. It is vigilance. The question this story leaves behind is not who failed him. It is whether we have learned to recognize failure before silence becomes policy. Whether we understand that transparency delayed is not neutrality, but a choice with consequences. For those who loved him, this truth may never bring peace. For those who watched from a distance, it may offer something else: awareness, responsibility, a refusal to accept simple answers to complex losses. This story is not over, and neither is the question of who we protect when we choose silence.